Get pulled into a vivid vortex of intense emotion, where every twist of the narrative leaves you breathless and wanting more. This is storytelling designed for the modern viewer who craves quality and cinematic depth. Hit subscribe now and don't get left behind in the storm of drama.
He was already popping champagne when I walked through the door. That image, my stepmother's boyfriend, Raymond, standing in my father's kitchen with a bottle of Moët, his girlfriend draped across the counter in a silk blouse, is burned into my memory. Not because it shocked me, but because I had been waiting for exactly that moment for 6 months, and I was recording every second of it. Let me back up. My father, Daniel, was a quiet man who built things with his hands. He started a small construction company in Asheville, North Carolina, when he was 24 years old, running it out of the back of a Ford pickup truck. By the time I was born, Hartwell Construction had grown into a regional firm worth several $1 million. My father wasn't flashy about it. He drove the same truck for 12 years. He packed his own lunch. He coached my softball team every spring until I left for college. He was, without question, the most disciplined person I have ever known. My mother passed away when I was 9. Breast cancer, fast and merciless. After that, it was just the two of us for a long time. Dad never really dated. He threw himself into work and into raising me. I grew up on job sites, learning to read blueprints before I learned to drive. When I graduated from NC State with a business degree, my father quietly told me that he had been building the company for me, that one day I would run it. I was 26 when he met Diane. She came into his life through a charity gala, the kind of event my father normally avoided but attended that year because one of his longtime clients had begged him to fill a table. Diane was polished. She laughed at all of his jokes. She had an opinion about wine, and an opinion about art, and an opinion about everything, delivered in this smooth, unhurried voice that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. My father, who had spent 17 years eating dinner alone, was not prepared for someone who paid that much attention to him. They dated for 8 months. Then he told me they were getting married. I tried. I genuinely tried to be happy for him. I went to the engagement dinner. I helped pick the venue. I smiled in every photograph. But there were things I noticed that I could not stop noticing. The way Diane never asked about the business unless the conversation touched on finances. The way she redirected questions about her own background. The way her eyes moved around a room, always calculating, always landing on whatever was most expensive. I mentioned it once, carefully, to my father. He told me I was being protective and that he understood why, but that Diane made him happy for the first time in years. I let it go. He deserved to be happy. They were married in October. By the following spring, my father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis changed everything about Diane's behavior, though not in the ways you might expect. She did not become more attentive or more affectionate. She became more administrative. Suddenly, she had opinions about estate planning, about the company's structure, about which accounts should have joint access. She hired her own attorney, not the family lawyer my father had used for 20 years, to help them revise the will. I asked my father about it. He told me Diane was just trying to make things easier for everyone. He seemed tired. The Parkinson's was progressing faster than the doctors had initially estimated, and the medications made it hard for him to focus for long stretches. He trusted her. He was exhausted, and he trusted her. And I think part of him was relieved that someone was handling the logistics so he didn't have to. What I did not know then was that Raymond had already been in the picture for months. I found out about Raymond the way you find out about most things you were never supposed to know, by accident. I had stopped by the house on a Tuesday afternoon to drop off some documents for my father, and Diane's car was not in the driveway, so I used my key. I heard a man's voice coming from the upstairs office, not my father's voice, lower, laughing at something. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened, and then I heard Diane's voice say, very quietly, "Not yet. We just need a little more time." I knocked loudly on the banister before I went up. By the time I reached the office, the man was gone. Out the back stairs, I realized later, and Diane was sitting at the desk, perfectly composed, telling me my father was resting and that she'd make sure he got the documents. She smiled the whole time. I smiled back, and on the drive home, I called my father's original attorney, Margaret Cho, and asked her if she could meet with me that week. Margaret had handled my father's legal affairs for 15 years. She knew the business, she knew the family history, she knew what my father had always intended. When I sat down across from her desk and told her what I had seen and heard and what I had been noticing for months, she did not dismiss me. She pulled out a legal pad and started writing. "Has he changed his will since the diagnosis?" she asked. "I don't know the specifics," I said. "He told me Diane hired someone new." Margaret's expression did not change, but her pen stopped moving for just a moment. "Who?" she asked. I gave her the name Diane had mentioned. Margaret wrote it down. "All right," she said. "I want you to do a few things for me. Don't confront anyone. Don't let Diane know you have concerns. And starting today, I want you to keep a record of everything." I started keeping a record. Over the next 3 months, I documented every unusual financial movement I could observe. I was still technically listed as a signatory on 2 of the company's operational accounts, a detail that had never been updated when Diane came into the picture. I could see transaction histories. I watched as a new consulting firm, one I had never heard of and could find no legitimate record of, began receiving monthly wire transfers from Hartwell Construction. The amounts started small, $8,000, $12,000. Then, in January, $45,000 in a single transfer, logged under Strategic Advisory Services. I looked up the consulting firm. It had been registered in Delaware 7 months earlier. The registered agent's address was a mailbox store outside Charlotte. The name on the LLC paperwork was not Raymond's name. It was the name of Raymond's brother. I brought everything to Margaret. She had already been doing her own research. "There's more," she said. She slid a document across the desk. "This is the revised will, filed 4 months ago. Your father left you a 30% stake in the company. Diane receives the remaining 70%, along with the house and all liquid assets." I stared at the page. "That's not what he told me." "I know what he told you," Margaret said. "The question is whether he understood what he was signing when he signed this. The Parkinson's, the medication. His capacity at the time of signing is something we can challenge. But I want you to look at page 7. Page 7 contained a notarization. I read the notary's name and signature. Then I read it again. The notary who had certified my father's signature on the revised will was Raymond's girlfriend. I did not scream. I did not cry. I sat very still in Margaret's office, and I looked at the document for a long time, and then I said, "What do we do?" Margaret had already started building the case. Here is what I learned over the next 2 months. Through Margaret's investigation and through a forensic accountant named Paul Ryder, who had worked on estate fraud cases for 30 years. The consulting firm Raymond's brother had set up had received a total of $230,000 in wire transfers from Hartwell Construction over 14 months. Raymond himself had no formal employment that could be verified. He had 2 prior civil judgments against him in Georgia, both related to financial disputes. The notary who certified my father's will had a license that had been issued only 6 weeks before the will was signed. And my father, my exhausted, trusting, medicated father, had almost certainly not understood the full implications of what he signed. Margaret filed for a formal review of my father's testamentary capacity. At the same time, she contacted the North Carolina Secretary of State's office regarding the fraudulent notarization, and she referred the wire transfer evidence to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Charlotte. I did not tell my father any of this. He was declining, and I made the choice, the hardest choice I have ever made, to protect him from the weight of what was happening. I visited him every week. I sat with him on the back porch. I brought him the coffee he liked from the diner near his old office, in the paper cup he preferred. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. He passed away on a Thursday morning in March. I was with him. Diane was in the room too, standing near the window, very composed. I remember thinking that she hadn't touched him once in the 2 hours before he died. The funeral was 4 days later. Beautiful service. Diane wore a black dress and received condolences graciously. I stood next to her and thanked people for coming and felt like I was watching the whole thing from somewhere slightly outside my own body. Raymond attended the reception. I saw him across the room holding a glass of wine, talking to one of my father's former subcontractors. He didn't know who I was. We had never been formally introduced. He looked at me once, the way you look at someone you don't recognize, and then looked away. I smiled at no one in particular and kept my phone in my hand. The closing on the house was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. Diane had moved quickly. She had listed the property, the house my father built where I grew up, where my mother's rose garden still grew along the back fence. within 10 days of his death. The buyer was an LLC. The sale price was $850,000. Margaret believed the arrangement had been planned well in advance of my father's death and that Raymond was likely connected to the buyer's LLC as well, which would have allowed them to extract the property's equity while avoiding certain estate tax complications. On the morning of the closing, I put on a gray blazer, the kind my father always said made me look like I meant business. I drove to the title company's office in downtown Asheville. I parked 2 blocks away and sat in the car for a few minutes. Margaret had filed an emergency motion the previous day to freeze the asset transfer, citing the pending challenge to the will's validity and the fraudulent notarization. The title company had received formal notice that morning. I walked into the building at 10:08 a.m. The closing was scheduled for 10:10 in conference room B. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Diane was seated at the table in a charcoal pantsuit, a folder open in front of her. Raymond was beside her, jacket off, looking relaxed. His girlfriend, the notary, was not present. His girlfriend with a notary was not present. Across the table sat the buyer's representative and a title agent who was already visibly tense. The moment Diane saw me, the composure she had been maintaining for 6 months cracked, just slightly, at the corners. Her eyes went sharp. "What are you doing here?" she said. Not a question. A warning. "I was invited," I said. I sat down at the far end of the table. The title agent cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, we've received a legal notice this morning from an attorney of record regarding a challenge to the estate's transfer authority. Until that matter is resolved, we're unable to complete this closing." Raymond's jaw tightened. "What kind of challenge?" "A challenge to the validity of the will under which the property transfer is being authorized," Margaret said. She had come in behind me and was standing in the doorway, briefcase in hand, looking entirely unbothered. "Additionally, we've raised questions about the notarization of the will, which appears to have been certified by an individual with a conflict of interest and a newly issued license with no prior record of professional practice." The room went very quiet. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, walking to the table and setting down a document, "we have referred evidence of wire transfers totaling $230,000 from Hartwell Construction to a shell entity to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Agents reached out to me this morning to confirm receipt. Raymond's girlfriend had apparently been waiting outside. She had texted him during the meeting. I watched him look at his phone under the table and go still. Diane started to say something. Her attorney, the one she had hired, not Margaret, put a hand on her arm. 2 days later, Raymond was taken in for questioning. His brother's LLC was subpoenaed. The notary's license was suspended pending investigation. The will challenge moved forward in probate court, supported by testimony from 2 of my father's physicians regarding his cognitive state at the time of signing, and by a handwriting expert who raised questions about several signatures on the revised documents. The probate process took 4 months. At the end of it, the court found that my father had lacked testamentary capacity at the time the revised will was executed, and that the notarization had been improper. The estate reverted to the prior will. The one Margaret had on file, the one my father had made when I was 22, the one that left Hartwell Construction, and everything he had built to me. Raymond was indicted on federal wire fraud charges. The amount in question, once investigators traced all the transfers through the Shell network, was over $1.2 million. He pled not guilty. The trial date was set. Diane received nothing from the estate. Under North Carolina law, a surviving spouse who has participated in conduct that defrauds the estate can be barred from taking an elective share. Margaret had prepared for that argument for months. I drove to the house the week after the probate ruling. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a while, looking at the front porch, the oak tree in the yard that my father had planted the year I was born. My mother's roses had overgrown along the back fence, the way they always did in early spring, going wherever they wanted to without anyone to prune them back. I went inside. I walked through every room. In his office, on the shelf above the desk, my father kept a framed photograph of the 2 of us from my college graduation. I was in a blue cap and gown. He had his arm around me, and he was grinning so wide you could see every line around his eyes. He looked so proud that it almost hurt to look at. I took the photograph off the shelf and held it for a while. He had built everything for me. He had told me that, clearly, when I was 22 years old, standing in a hard hat on a job site he was particularly proud of. He said he had been working towards something his whole life, and that the something was making sure I would be okay after he was gone. He had also, as it turned out, never actually changed his will. The revised documents Diane's attorney had filed were what Margaret had spent 4 months proving were not his true intentions, not his true signature on at least 2 key pages, and not certified by any neutral party acting in good faith. My father had been playing the long game without even knowing it. He had simply trusted the right attorney when he was well and left behind a paper trail that could not be fully buried. Account records, correspondence, the original will, physician notes that documented his declining cognition during the exact period the revised will was supposedly executed. The company went back to work. I promoted the operations manager my father had trusted for 11 years to VP. I learned the parts of the business I didn't know yet. I made mistakes, and I fixed them. I never screamed in that conference room. I never raised my voice once in any of the conversations, hearings, or depositions that followed. Raymond's attorney tried to rattle me during my deposition, asking me questions about my relationship with my father, about the company finances, about whether I had financial motivations of my own. I answered every question calmly, specifically, with documentation. My father taught me that. He used to say that the most dangerous thing you could be in a disagreement was the calmest person in the room, because calm people don't make mistakes under pressure, and rattled people always do. Raymond made a great many mistakes. He left a wire transfer trail across 4 states. He used a notary with no professional history and no plausible explanation for her involvement. He celebrated a closing that had not yet happened and would never happen. And he made the particular irreversible mistake of underestimating the daughter of the man he was trying to steal from. I sit in my father's office now to do most of my work. The photograph is back on the shelf. I talk to him sometimes, quietly, when the building is empty and the day has been long. I tell him about the job we just won in Boone, about the bridge project in Watauga County, about the things I'm learning and the things I'm proud of. I think he can hear me. I think he knows, and I think, wherever he is not surprised by how any of this turned out.